In a high-stakes TV interview, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt faces sharp-witted talk show host Rachel Harper, a battle of words where faith, resilience, and media manipulation collide. Secrets unravel, truths are exposed, and both women are pushed to their emotional limits. Who will come out on top? The studio lights hum quietly overhead, casting a sharp, bright glow across the polished stage. Camera operators moved like ghosts behind thick glass panels. The floor director held up 3 fingers, counting down with deliberate slowness as the sound technician adjusted the volume levels. A hushed tension hovered in the air, a silence so fragile it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Rachel Harper, the host of Straight Truth, sat poised in her signature leather chair. With her sharp cheekbones and piercing gaze, she had long commanded the attention of her viewers. Her confidence was palpable, and her skepticism was well known. Tonight, she wore a deep plum blouse that matched the tone of her inquisitive energy, calculated, probing, and elegant. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, the newly appointed White House press secretary, young, poised, and undeniably striking in her powder blue blazer. She exuded the practiced grace of someone who'd been trained to walk into storms with smile. But behind her calm eyes, there was a flicker of something more complex. Perhaps uncertainty, perhaps resolve. She adjusted her microphone discreetly, her fingertips trembling ever so slightly. The red light on the main camera blinked to life. Rachel's voice cut through the silence, warm but edged with steel. Good evening, America. I'm Rachel Harper, and welcome to Straight Truth. Tonight, we're joined by someone who's been making headlines, not just for her words, but for what those words might mean. She turned slightly toward her guest, a smile twitching at the corners of her lips. With me is Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, and some might say the face of a new generation in politics. Karoline's expression remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's an honor to be here. Rachel leaned forward, just slightly. Let's not waste time. The country is watching, and they want answers. You've spoken recently about faith, yours specifically, and how it influences your role in the administration. Some have called it refreshing. Others, deeply concerning. Which is it? Karoline's voice was calm, but her tone was deliberate. Rachel, I believe faith is not a liability in leadership. It's a compass. I don't speak about it to convert anyone. I speak about it to be transparent. Because in this job, honesty should matter. Rachel arched an eyebrow. Honesty, sure. But aren't you in an administration that's been accused of spinning the truth more than telling it? A flicker passed across Karoline's face. Anger, maybe, or just a sting of truth. But she didn't flinch. I can't speak for every decision made by every official. I can only speak for myself. And I show up every day trying to be a bridge between the truth and the American people. There was a pause, measured, weighted, before Rachel struck again. So let's test that bridge. Last week, the president stood at the Capitol and promised healing and unity. But hours later, his administration pushed a policy that half the country sees as divisive. Which message should Americans believe? Karoline didn't miss a beat. Both. Healing doesn't mean avoiding difficult decisions. Sometimes unity begins with honesty about where we are and what it will take to move forward. Rachel tilted her head, eyes narrowing. That sounds nice, Karoline. But a lot of people feel lied to, not just by your administration, but by the entire political class. How do you reconcile your faith with working in a system so many see as morally bankrupt? A silence fell between them, the kind that stretches longer than a clock's second hand suggests. Karoline inhaled deeply, the smallest crack in her polished demeanor. That's a fair question, she said finally, and I wrestle with it every day. But faith isn't about purity. It's about presence, about showing up. Jesus didn't run from corruption. He walked into it, fully aware of the cost. Rachel blinked. For the first time, her expression softened, not out of agreement, but curiosity. That's a bold comparison. Karoline nodded slowly. So is choosing to lead in times like these. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsentimental. Backstage, producers scribbled notes furiously. The control room was buzzing. phones ringing off their hooks as viewers called in. Something was happening on screen that went beyond partisan noise. Rachel leaned back, folded her arms. Let's pivot to a recent briefing. You quoted the book of Micah. What does the law require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? That's not exactly standard political language. Karoline smiled faintly. Maybe it should be. Isn't that alienating for Americans who don't share your faith? Rachel pressed. I don't think so. Those words aren't about religion. They're about character, justice, mercy, humility. I'd hope we can agree those values aren't exclusive to any belief system. Rachel's reply came quickly. But when those values are invoked selectively, say, to justify a policy or defend a controversy, it starts to feel like theater. Karoline's eyes didn't leave hers. I don't use scripture as a shield. I use it as a mirror. If it ever starts to feel like theater, maybe that's a sign we need to pause and ask ourselves what we're really performing for. Rachel went still for a second, watching, measuring. Then, Karoline, do you think you're better than the system you represent? No, she said plainly. But I think I'm trying to be better in it. That's all any of us can do. The tension between them shifted, softened. It wasn't agreement, far from it. But there was something mutual now, recognition, respect. Two women from opposing poles, each holding her ground. Rachel turned to the camera. We'll be right back after the break. When we return, Karoline Leavitt on power, prayer, and the price of standing firm. The red light faded, and the studio dimmed slightly as the broadcast cut to commercial. Technicians moved in with powder and cables. Water bottles were exchanged. But Karoline and Rachel didn't speak. They just looked at each other, two minds sharpening in silence. What the country would see when the cameras came back on was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. Rachel leaned back in her chair, lips curving into a skeptical smile as she pressed forward with another question, her voice tinged with challenge. All right, Karoline, let's go a little deeper. You've said this administration was placed by God. Some people might hear that and think you're saying the election was divine intervention. Do you really believe that? Karoline took a deep breath, her composure unwavering, her tone firm but not confrontational. I believe God raises up leaders and brings them down. That's not me saying everything a leader does is godly or right. But yes, I believe God is sovereign over who's in power. Rachel's brow arched. Even someone as controversial as President Stratton? Are you saying everything he does has divine approval? No, Karoline said quickly, gently. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that God is sovereign. Sometimes he appoints leaders for blessing, sometimes for judgment, sometimes for purposes we don't understand. But that doesn't mean we check our discernment at the door. Christians should absolutely hold leaders accountable. Rachel tilted her head, intrigued. But isn't that a bit of a theological tightrope? I mean, if God put someone in power, aren't you questioning God when you criticize them? Karoline smiled faintly. Not at all. God put Saul on the throne in Israel, but David still knew Saul was wrong when he acted unjustly. God's sovereignty doesn't excuse human behavior. It just reminds us that we're part of a bigger story, and that our hope isn't ultimately in presidents or policies. There was a pause, a beat of silence thick with contemplation, as Rachel studied Karoline across the studio lights. She shifted slightly in her chair, the edge in her tone softening just a hair. All right, fair enough, Rachel said. Let me ask you this, then. What gives you, a young press secretary who's barely been in Washington 5 minutes, the moral authority to stand up in front of the country and talk about right and wrong? Karoline's expression didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. It's not about me having moral authority. I don't claim to be perfect. I'm a sinner saved by grace. But I do believe we each have a responsibility to speak truth, especially when we're given a platform. Rachel leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. But you're speaking on behalf of the president. Doesn't that mean you're complicit in what he says? What he does? Karoline nodded, not defensive. It means I have a responsibility to tell the truth, to represent what he's doing and saying accurately, and to be honest when I'm asked hard questions, even if that puts me in a tough spot. Rachel looked surprised. So you're saying you've disagreed with him? I'm saying I've wrestled with things. I pray before I speak. And I've had moments where I've had to seek God's wisdom, not just political strategy. The studio fell into another stillness. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Rachel wasn't attacking now. She was probing, curious, something in Karoline's posture disarming her just enough to break through the performance. Tell me about one of those moments, Rachel said, voice quieter. Karoline hesitated, and the pause was weighty. She glanced off camera for a split second, then met Rachel's gaze. A few months ago, she began, I was asked to go on air and defend a policy decision I didn't fully understand. It was moving fast. I had talking points. But my spirit wasn't settled. I went into the bathroom right before the segment, locked the stall, and prayed, God, if I speak, make it true. Don't let me be a mouthpiece for something that's not righteous. I walked out, and I changed what I said. I gave the facts, but I didn't spin them. And afterward, I thought I might get fired. Rachel was listening closely now. And did you? No, Karoline said. Someone in the West Wing pulled me aside and said, that was the most honest thing I've heard on TV in weeks. And I thought, maybe there's still room for integrity in this town. Rachel gave a slow nod, her expression hard to read. That's interesting. I didn't expect you to admit that. Most people in your position would toe the line. I'm not most people, Karoline said, and her voice held the soft strength of someone who had made peace with her convictions. I'm not here to play a part. I'm here to serve with integrity. And if that costs me something, so be it. Rachel leaned back again, as if recalibrating. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the power dynamic. Karoline wasn't just defending herself. She was commanding the space. Let's talk about the backlash, Rachel said, tone sharpening again. You've been accused of being a mouthpiece for Christian nationalism. You've been called a puppet, a zealot, a hypocrite. How do you respond to those labels? Karoline didn't blink. I expected them. Jesus said we'd be hated for following him. I'm not here to win applause. I'm here to be faithful. Rachel's eyes narrowed. So you're embracing persecution? Karoline answered simply, I'm embracing the cross. That's what my faith calls me to. It doesn't mean I enjoy being criticized, but it means I don't fear it. There was a pause again, a beat of quiet, and for the first time, Rachel looked less like a host and more like a human being. Curious, perhaps even moved. You really believe all of this? Rachel said softly. Don't you? I do, Karoline said, with all my heart. Something flickered in Rachel's expression. Conflict, maybe, or memory. She shifted again, then said, almost reluctantly, that's rare, especially in this town. It doesn't have to be, Karoline said, her voice warm but unwavering. What's rare is someone being willing to stand in the fire for what they believe. Rachel gave a short laugh, half amusement, half disbelief. And you think you're standing in the fire? I think I'm exactly where God wants me to be, Karoline replied, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The studio lights buzzed quietly overhead. The cameras kept rolling. The audience, watching at home, saw something begin to unfold. Not a typical political sparring match, but collision of worldviews, clashing yet curious, firm yet strangely respectful. Rachel adjusted her papers again, but her hands weren't as steady now. Let me ask you this, Karoline. You say God's in control. You say truth matters more than politics. But what about when telling the truth gets people hurt? When it costs policy wins or public trust? Isn't there a pragmatic side you have to consider? There's always a cost, Karoline said. But when we start compromising truth for power, we lose our soul. I'd rather lose a news cycle than lose my witness. Rachel's eyes flashed. That's a bold statement. It's the only one I can make and still sleep at night. Rachel sat back, expression unreadable. There was a long silence between them, the kind that says more than words. Then she spoke again, voice quiet. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. Karoline said, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Rachel chuckled under her breath, not entirely unfriendly. All right, let's take a break. But don't go anywhere. We're just getting started. Karoline nodded once, steady and sure as the camera light blinked red, and the segment faded into commercial. In that moment, she didn't just look like a press secretary. She looked like someone standing her ground in a whirlwind of agendas and expectations, grounded by something deeper, faith, conviction, and a quiet, unshakable peace. The camera light blinked off, and the set went quiet for a moment as the crew shuffled behind the scenes, preparing for the next segment. Rachel Harper sat back in her chair, drumming her fingers lightly on the edge of her desk. There was something in the air now, a subtle shift in the dynamic between her and Karoline. The skepticism that had initially defined Rachel's approach had softened just a touch, enough to leave her visibly pondering what she had just heard. Karoline, however, remained poised, as calm and composed as she had been from the moment she stepped into the studio. The press secretary's demeanor was one of quiet confidence, like a rock standing firm against a rising tide. She wasn't rattled. Not yet, anyway. So, Rachel said, breaking the silence, let's talk about the president again. Her tone was measured, but there was still an undercurrent of challenge. You defended him at every turn. But what about his critics? He's been called divisive, reckless even. How do you reconcile your faith with his actions? Karoline's gaze remained steady. My faith doesn't depend on the actions of any leader, Rachel. It's about what God is doing in the world. He's always working, even when things seem dark, even when people fail. Rachel tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the words carefully. But surely you can't pretend there's no fault in what's happening now? The rhetoric, the policies, they're tearing people apart. Don't you worry about the consequences? Karoline was quiet for a beat, considering her response. She could feel the weight of the question. Rachel wasn't just speaking for the public now. She was speaking for the disillusioned, the hurt, the people who saw the president as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. And yet, Karoline's voice remained steady. Of course I worry about the consequences, she said softly. But my hope doesn't rest in who's in power. It doesn't rest in politics at all. It rests in what's eternal. Rachel's brow furrowed. So, you're saying you're not worried about the direction the country is headed? No, Karoline replied firmly. I'm concerned, yes. But I also believe that God is bigger than any political system, any leader, any election. If we lose sight of that, then we lose everything. Rachel looked at her, lips pressed together in a thin line, her expression a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. I'm trying to understand you, Karoline. You're telling me that despite everything we see on the news, despite the growing divisions, you think God is still in control? I do, Karoline said, her voice unwavering. I believe God has a plan that's bigger than the present moment. It's not about ignoring the struggles of the present, but about having a perspective that stretches beyond them. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and Rachel didn't respond right away. It was clear she wasn't used to hearing someone speak so confidently about faith in a political climate that was so fraught with distrust and division. For a moment, the talk show host, who was always in control, always the one asking the tough questions, seemed to retreat into a more vulnerable place. Her mind seemed to be racing, trying to reconcile the Karoline in front of her with the image of the political landscape she had grown so accustomed to reporting on. She cleared her throat, then continued, her voice softer now, almost searching. But, Karoline, don't you think the president's divisiveness is making that faith harder for people to hold on to? When the country is split like this, it's difficult to see where the hope is, where God's presence is in the middle of all this. Karoline's expression softened as she met Rachel's eyes. I get it, Rachel. I really do. It's hard to see God when things are falling apart. But that's when he's closest, when we're at our weakest, when we're at our most vulnerable. That's the hope I'm talking about. Not that everything will be easy or perfect, but that God is working even in the hard moments. He's there, even when we can't see it. Rachel's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, slowly, deliberately. It was almost as though the veneer of skepticism had cracked just a bit more. Karoline was giving her something that, for all the political wrangling Rachel had been part of, was profoundly simple and profoundly difficult to dismiss. "I've been in this business a long time," Rachel said after a moment, her voice low but measured, "and I've talked to a lot of people who say they have faith, but none of them ever sound like you. You're not trying to score points. You're not trying to convince me to vote for anyone. You're just talking about something bigger." Karoline smiled faintly, a soft, knowing smile. "That's because I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just trying to be honest about what I believe." Rachel sat back in her chair, her fingers drumming against the armrest. The skepticism hadn't entirely disappeared, but now there was something else in her eyes, something closer to respect, perhaps even a touch of admiration. It was as if the walls she had built around herself in this interview had begun to crumble, piece by piece, with every word Karoline spoke. "So where does that leave us?" Rachel asked quietly, as if she had just been struck by a new understanding of the conversation they were having. "I don't know," Karoline said, her tone gentle. "Maybe we're not as far apart as we thought." Rachel shook her head, almost to herself. "Maybe not, but I still don't know if I can ever fully embrace this idea of divine control in the political realm. It feels too messy, too complicated." Karoline nodded, understanding. "I get that. Politics is messy. But I think it's worth remembering that God isn't confined to our boxes. He works in ways we don't always understand." The conversation lingered there for a moment. The tension, while still present, had softened into something more contemplative. Rachel wasn't dismissing Karoline anymore, and Karoline wasn't rushing to offer answers or explanations. They were simply two people, one a believer, the other a skeptic, having a conversation about things that were bigger than either of them. Rachel took a deep breath, as if preparing for the next question. "All right," she said, her voice steady once more. "Let's talk about your personal faith. You've mentioned that you pray before every briefing. Can you tell me what that looks like for you? How do you pray in the middle of all this?" Karoline's expression brightened a little at the question, a soft light filling her eyes. "I pray for wisdom, first and foremost. I pray for clarity. I pray that my words would honor God and serve the people I'm speaking to, whether they agree with me or not." Rachel's gaze softened as she listened, her curiosity piqued. "And does it help?" "Every time," Karoline said firmly. "It helps me keep my heart in the right place. It helps me stay focused on the bigger picture." The atmosphere in the studio had shifted entirely now. The questions were still pointed, but they were coming from a place of curiosity, not judgment. Rachel leaned in just a bit, as if she truly wanted to understand, really understand, what drove a young press secretary to stand so confidently in a world so full of doubt. Before the break, Rachel had seen Karoline as just another cog in a political machine. Now, however, she saw her as something else, a person trying to navigate the complexities of faith and politics, trying to live out her convictions in a way that made sense to her, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else. "All right, Karoline," Rachel said, her voice almost warm now. "One last question. I know we're running out of time, but I think people need to hear this. Why do you think you're here? Why do you think you've ended up in this position?" Karoline took a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Because God has placed me here. I don't know why. I don't know what's ahead, but I believe I'm where I'm supposed to be, and I trust Him to guide me through it." Rachel nodded slowly, absorbing the answer. There was no bravado in Karoline's words, just quiet conviction, the kind that seemed impossible to fake. For the first time in the interview, Rachel realized she wasn't just talking to a press secretary anymore. She was talking to someone who believed that her every step had been ordained for a purpose. And that's what keeps you going, isn't it? Rachel said softly, almost to herself. Karoline met her gaze with a steady look. "That's what keeps me going." The silence between them stretched a little longer than before. It wasn't uncomfortable, but was heavy, like two people standing on opposite sides of a deep chasm, and yet, somehow, understanding each other more than they had when they started. Rachel leaned back in her chair and smiled, A real smile this time, not the sarcastic or skeptical smile she had worn at the start of the interview. "Well," she said, "I have to admit, Karoline, you've given me a lot to think about." Karoline smiled too, her expression open and unguarded. "That's all I can ask for." The studio lights flickered as the conversation shifted once more, transitioning from deep personal reflections to more pressing, immediate issues of the day. Rachel Harper, despite the softer tone she had taken, was still an investigative journalist at her core, unwilling to let go of the questions that needed to be asked, the ones that were still simmering beneath the surface. "So," Rachel began, leaning forward again, her voice picking up a bit more of the sharpness it had at the start of the interview, "let's talk about the current administration. How do you balance your personal faith with the difficult decisions you have to support, decisions that may go against what you believe to be right?" Karoline paused, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the desk as if organizing her thoughts before responding. The question was not unexpected, but the intensity of Rachel's voice made it clear that this was not going to be a simple, scripted answer. The room felt a little colder now, the air heavier, as though the stakes of the interview had just risen. "Faith doesn't mean everything is easy," Karoline began, her tone steady but with noticeable depth of emotion creeping into her voice. "It's not a guarantee that things will always align perfectly with what we believe to be right. But I think faith means trusting that there's something bigger at play, even when I don't have all the answers." Rachel's gaze never left Karoline's face, her eyes narrowing just slightly. She could sense the sincerity in Karoline's words, but the journalist in her couldn't help but press on. "But you must have doubts," she said. "Doesn't it ever feel like you're compromising your beliefs? You're standing behind policies that affect real people, policies that hurt people. Do you never question that?" There was the question that had been hanging in the air, unspoken until now. Rachel's tone was softer than before, but the weight of her words was palpable. Karoline didn't flinch. She met Rachel's eyes with a calmness that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. "I do," Karoline said, her voice low but unwavering. "I question everything. Every day. That's part of being human. But my faith doesn't allow me to just walk away from it. It calls me to stay, to engage, to try to make things better from within, even when the system seems broken." Rachel seemed to absorb that for a moment, the journalist's skepticism warring with the human instinct to respect the strength of Karoline's resolve. "But don't you think staying in a broken system is just perpetuating the problem?" Rachel asked, her tone more contemplative now. "Isn't it easier to walk away and say, 'This isn't what I believe in'? Isn't that the honest choice?" "I don't know," Karoline said, her voice softening. "Maybe it would be easier. Maybe it would be cleaner. But I think sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stay, to continue to speak up, and to try to affect change, even when it seems impossible." Rachel didn't respond right away, her expression softening in response to Karoline's words. The skeptic inside her still struggled with the idea that someone could remain so steadfast in their beliefs without compromise, without doubt. But Rachel had been around long enough to know when someone was speaking from a place of deep conviction. And in that moment, Karoline's quiet strength, her refusal to back down, was undeniable. "All right," Rachel said after a pause, the gears in her mind shifting yet again. "But let's be honest, Karoline. It's not just about faith, is it? Politics is a game of power. The president, your boss, is using that power in ways that seem to disregard the very principles you're talking about: fairness, justice, compassion. So, how do you justify supporting a system that often seems to do the opposite of what you believe in?" Karoline took a deep breath, and for a moment, Rachel wondered if she had gone too far. But Karoline was unfazed, her response immediate and resolute. "It's not just about supporting the system. It's about trying to make it better," she said firmly. "I know there's a lot of frustration out there. I see it every day. But I believe that real change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by tearing everything down. It happens by finding ways to rebuild, even if it's just one brick at a time." Rachel raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "And you think that's possible? Rebuilding from within?" Karoline nodded slowly. "I do. I believe that change is always possible. But it requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to keep fighting for what's right, even when it feels like the fight is endless. There was a pause as Rachel processed Karoline's words. The air between them had thickened with the weight of the conversation, both women fully aware of the gravity of what had just been said. Rachel was no longer just interviewing Karoline. She was engaging with a person who believed, with her whole heart, that despite everything, the fight for justice and fairness was worth it. Rachel exhaled slowly, her eyes flickering toward the camera, almost as if she were contemplating the next segment of the interview, or perhaps the implications of the one they were currently in. "So let me ask you this," she said, her voice changing again, taking on a more direct edge. "If you really believe that change is possible, how do you explain the growing division in the country? The distrust of government? The anger that's boiling over?" Karoline's eyes didn't waver, her voice staying steady as she answered. "I think the division is real, yes. But I also think that division doesn't have to be permanent. It doesn't have to define us. People are angry because they feel unheard. And sometimes in the chaos of politics, it's easy to forget that these are real people with real struggles. They're not just statistics or talking points." Rachel couldn't help but nod, her mind already processing the implications of what Karoline had said. "And what would you say to the people who feel like their voices aren't being heard? The ones who don't see the change you're talking about?" Karoline leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "I would tell them that I hear them. I would tell them that I understand their frustration. And I would tell them that I'm fighting for them, too. It's not easy, but I believe that if we keep talking, if we keep fighting for what's right, change will come." Rachel sat back in her chair, her expression still thoughtful, as if trying to figure out how she was supposed to respond. For all the challenges and contradictions that still lingered in Karoline's words, there was a kind of sincerity there that Rachel couldn't ignore. It was a sincerity that cut to the politics and the media games, a sincerity that made her rethink her assumptions. The silence stretched on for a moment, neither woman rushing to fill it. Then Rachel broke the quiet, her voice a little more somber. "I think you believe that," she said quietly. "I really do." Karoline met her gaze, her eyes full of quiet determination. "I do," she said simply. "And I'll keep believing it, no matter what." The tension in the room eased just slightly, but the weight of their words lingered. Rachel had come into the interview expecting to unearth contradictions, to expose the flaws in Karoline's reasoning, but now, for the first time, she was starting to see the press secretary not as a political pawn, but as a person who genuinely believed in the possibility of change, even when the world around her seemed to say otherwise. The room was heavy with an air of quiet contemplation after Karoline's words. The cameras had slowed down, and the tension that had earlier marked the conversation seemed to soften, even if only slightly. Rachel Harper, always a sharp and meticulous journalist, wasn't easily swayed. But Karoline Leavitt's words had struck a chord. The divide between them, between the world of unyielding politics and the world of human vulnerability, seemed smaller than it had been when the interview started. Rachel leaned back in her chair, taking in a slow breath. She had her next question ready, one that she knew would be difficult, but one that she felt compelled to ask. "You talk about fighting for change, Karoline," Rachel began, her voice gentler than before, but with an unmistakable sense of purpose. "But how do you reconcile that with the actions of your administration, the policies that are affecting millions, policies that many would argue go against everything you've just said about fairness and justice?" Karoline's face remained calm, her posture unchanged, but her eyes flickered with familiar determination as she prepared to respond. The question wasn't new, but Rachel's tone made it clear that this was an attempt to expose contradictions. It was a plea for clarity. Rachel was looking for a moment of honesty, a recognition of complexities that no amount of political spin could undo. "I know it's not easy," Karoline said, her voice steady. "And I know it's not perfect. None of it is. But sometimes politics is about making difficult choices. There are competing interests, competing values. And sometimes you have to make a decision that doesn't seem like the right one in the moment, but you believe will lead to a better future." Rachel's eyes didn't leave her, but Karoline could see the skepticism brewing behind them. She was not just a reporter. She was a thinker, a person who saw the layers of every story. Karoline understood that. She had known from the start that this conversation wouldn't be easy. But this was the heart of the matter, the crux of what it meant to be in the room where the power lay. "So, is that your justification?" Rachel asked, tilting her head slightly, narrowing her gaze. "You're making sacrifices now because you believe in a better future? But what if that future doesn't come? What if these compromises are just that, compromises that hurt people in the present for a future that might never materialize?" There it was, the most pressing question of all. It was a question that haunted anyone who had ever worked in power, who had ever had to choose between short-term harm and long-term hope. Karoline could feel the weight of the question settle between them like a tangible thing, something that was impossible to ignore. "I understand the fear," Karoline said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I do, and I know that some of the decisions we've made have hurt people. I wish that wasn't the case. But if I walk away from that responsibility, then who's left to fight for the change I believe is still possible?" Rachel's expression softened just slightly, but she remained skeptical. "You're still convinced that the system works? That the system can be fixed from within?" Karoline nodded without hesitation. "I have to believe it. If I don't, then everything I'm doing here, everything I'm fighting for, loses its meaning. I know it's not a perfect world. I know it's not always pretty. But I have to keep going, because I believe there's still a way forward." Rachel's eyes flickered with something, maybe a mixture of respect and doubt. She knew Karoline's words were sincere, but that didn't make them any easier to accept. The world of politics, of policy, was full of contradictions, full of ideals that were often trampled under the weight of practicality. "You really believe that?" Rachel asked, her voice quieter now, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "That there's still hope for this system?" Karoline's gaze met hers directly, her expression resolute. "I have to," she said softly. "I have to believe that things can get better. Because if I don't, then I'm no different from the people who just give up, and that's not who I am." There was a silence then, long and unbroken. Rachel didn't immediately respond. She was listening, really listening, to what Karoline had just said. In her heart, she knew this wasn't the typical politician's deflection, the kind of answer she had come to expect after years of interviews. There was something in Karoline's voice, in the way she held herself, that made Rachel wonder if there was something more to this fight than she had initially assumed. Finally, Rachel spoke again, her voice gentle. "I'm not trying to paint you as a villain, Karoline," she said, her tone more measured now. "I'm just trying to understand. It's easy for people to sit on the sidelines and criticize. It's a lot harder to actually do something. But you have to admit, the people who are hurting, who are angry, are the ones who feel forgotten, who feel like their voices don't matter." Karoline exhaled, her eyes briefly downcast, as if weighed by the enormity of what Rachel was saying. "I don't forget them," she whispered. "I never will. But it's not easy, Rachel. It's never easy to be the one trying to hold it all together while the world around you feels like it's falling apart." Rachel nodded, accepting the sincerity of Karoline's words, but she couldn't let go of the core of the interview, the question that still loomed over everything. "So if it's this hard," she said, choosing her words with care, "why keep fighting? Why not walk away and make your own peace? Why continue to be part of something so broken?" Karoline's gaze lifted, her eyes meeting Rachel's with a quiet intensity. "Because if I walk away, I lose the chance to make a difference. And I'm not willing to give that up. Not yet. I've got to keep fighting, even if it's hard, because the people who feel unheard, who feel ignored, they need someone in that room who can hear them. And that's what I'm trying to do, every day." Rachel couldn't help but be moved by Karoline's conviction, even if she didn't entirely agree with her approach. There was a rawness to the conversation now, a depth that she hadn't expected when the interview first began. For all of the political jargon and media games, here was a woman who genuinely believed that change was possible, even in a system that often felt irredeemable. "All right," Rachel said, leaning back in her chair, her voice almost a whisper now. "I think I understand you a little better now, Karoline. This isn't just about power. It's about hope, isn't it?" Karoline nodded, her expression softening for the first time during the interview. "It's all about hope," she said quietly. "Because without hope, what else do we have? The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air. It was clear that this interview, for all its tough questions, had unearthed something deeper than either of them had anticipated. A conversation not just about politics, but about the human heart and the fragile hope that it could make a difference in the world. As the final moments of the interview approached, the tension in the room shifted. The cameras were still rolling, but the rawness of the conversation had brought a subtle intimacy to the exchange. Rachel Harper, ever the skeptic, looked at Karoline Leavitt one last time. The sharpness in her eyes had softened, the lines between them now blurred by the weight of the conversation they had just shared. For a moment, there was silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but a silence that spoke volumes, one that neither woman was willing to fill with anything less than the truth. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice steady but with a hint of something deeper, something human that hadn't been there when the interview had first begun. "You know, I started this interview thinking I had you all figured out, Karoline," Rachel said, "but now I'm not so sure. It's easy to make assumptions when you're sitting on the outside, looking in, but sometimes you've got to hear the story straight from the source to understand the complexity." Karoline smiled, but it wasn't one of triumph. It was a weary smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they've shared a piece of themselves and know the conversation is reaching its natural conclusion. "I get that," she said quietly. "It's easy to judge from a distance, but sometimes we have to sit down face to face to really see the whole picture." The crew began to move around the set, signaling the end of the segment, but Rachel wasn't ready to move just yet. She looked at Karoline one last time, as if searching for something in her expression, something beyond the politician, beyond the press secretary, beyond the public persona. "I appreciate your honesty, Karoline," Rachel said, the words carrying a sincerity that hadn't been present earlier in the conversation. "I know this wasn't easy for you. It's not easy for anyone in your position, but I think you've given me a lot to think about." Karoline nodded, the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones. "Thank you, Rachel. I know I don't have all the answers, but I believe in what I'm doing, and I believe in the people I'm fighting for." Rachel stood up, adjusting her notes as she prepared to wrap up. "I think, in the end, we're all just trying to do the best we can, right?" she said, her voice almost reflective now. Karoline stood as well, a sense of resolution in her posture as she extended a hand. "That's all we can do." They shook hands, the gesture a quiet symbol of mutual respect forged not through agreement, but through a shared understanding of the complexities of the world they lived in. No, the conversation hadn't solved anything, but it had opened up a space for something more important than answers, understanding. As the cameras shut off and the crew began to pack up, Rachel and Karoline shared a brief, knowing glance. It wasn't a triumphant end to an interview that one might expect from a high-profile press secretary, but in its quiet sincerity, it felt like something far more profound. And as Rachel Harper walked off the set, she carried with her a different view, not just of Karoline Leavitt, but of the system they both navigated. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was real, and in a world of sound bites and polished speeches, maybe that was the most important thing of all. The room emptied, the lights dimmed, and for just a moment, there was peace in the quiet aftermath. The kind of peace that comes from confronting the truth, however complicated or messy it might be.